It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. MayKao Hang, CEO of the Wilder Foundation. We are very pleased and thankful that Dr. Hang is willing to join us today to share her life experience and expertise related to the critically important issue of closing the educational achievement gap. So welcome.
Okay, I like to move around when I'm speaking, so I'll do this. I wanted to first start out with the fact that I'm a proud graduate of the St. Paul Public Schools. Yep, so anybody work for the St. Paul Public Schools or here from the St. Paul Public Schools? No? Oh, so disappointing. Okay, so I graduated in 1990 from Como Park Senior High, and I was one of the most diverse classes that graduated that year, because I was in that bridge generation where the St. Paul Public Schools, when I started, really didn't understand the Hmong community. And I was one of those kids who was an English language learner, and I kept being put in and out of ESL. Not very many people at the time, educators in particular, understood who the Hmong were. A lot of times we were called Laotian kids. And over the years, I saw it as progress after I got married when we lived on the east side, that the kids in the neighborhood actually knew that I was Hmong. They could actually identify me in that way, and it became more common to actually see Hmong students. Today in the city of St. Paul, there are many, many students who are foreign-born, first generation or second generation Hmong Americans, and I'm still the foreign-born generation. I came to the U.S. when I was 4, and I had to learn English, and I remember doing that. So thank you to all the educators who make it really a great place to be an American, to learn the language, and then to actually move on. So my personal story is Hmong refugee kid wins full scholarship to Ivy League University. Comes back to the hometown and dedicates her life to serving kids and families and older adults and people who experience considerable disadvantage because of life circumstance. The reason why I love public education is because it is where every kid, regardless of background, can go. And it worked for me, and that's why when I was asked to come to this conference, I thought, wow, that's wonderful. I'd love to come and talk to this group and to thank all of you for the work that you do day in and day out, because it's hard work, because you are here to educate everybody. The Wilder Foundation is an organization that's existed in this community for almost 110 years. I'm the CEO, and its mission is simple, to improve the lives of those who live in this community by all means appropriate, regardless of background. I mean, think about that. Almost 109 years ago, this is before the Civil Rights Movement, Amherst Wilder and his family left the original trust to the people in this community and said, do whatever it takes to actually make this community vibrant. That's my role in the community, to never let hope expire and to partner with organizations, people, the community to do good. In fact, our tagline is here for good. So just to give you some context, because it helps to understand where I'm coming from, both in terms of life experience and the kind of organization I lead. Now, we have been a partner with St. Paul Public Schools for almost its entire existence. In fact, I can't even trace back, looking at historical documents, how long we've actually been working with public schools, just in general. So I'd really like to start out by saying, this is not a presentation about the achievement gap. The achievement gap is happening all the time. And you guys know it's not just about what's in school, it's actually about what's out of school. So we do the out of school part. We go in and out of schools. In fact, we have 24 co-locations, three clinics. We do school-based mental health services. So we are seeing what I call in my lobby at Wilder, the failures of society to serve kids, because we're a nonprofit organization. It means that we see when there's systems failure in public systems, private systems, and just where people don't have any access. We also have a lot of work that we're doing that doesn't look like Wilder in the community. We are the lead agent and scaffold for the St. Paul Promise Neighborhood Initiative, trying to come up with a comprehensive solution from birth to career 80 different partners, including the public schools, public entities, private entities. We have Achievement Plus, community schools, John A. Johnson, Dayton's Bluff, North End Music Academy. So we've been in this space for a long time. But there are a lot of lessons we've learned. And one of the lessons we've learned is we're as good as the staff who are delivering the services are. Because ultimately our job is to impact the community and to help families be successful. And what I'm going to talk a lot about today is from an employer's perspective and a systems perspective, what have we at the Wilder Foundation been doing to actually improve how we show up in the world with kids and families and how we're orienting our staff. So it's a little bit of systems change, internal organizational change, and I wanted to just set that expectation because it does ultimately impact how we show up and how we educate our kids. So I wanted to start out with a story. I called it the Registered Campers Only story. So in one of my roles, I was a public administrator at Ramsey County Human Services, running all the county-based social services for people 18 and over in the county, and also all the kids with disabilities. And I happened to be camping at Whitewater State Park. And I was denied showers. As a Hmong family with two other Hmong families, my sisters, and small kids, I was turned away from the public showers. And how did this happen? White Park Ranger, drives down to our group campsite, which is does not have water or electricity, because that was the only campsite that was big enough to accommodate all of us. And he told us that we were illegally showering. Yep. So in front of my kids, he told us we could take our babies down to the river or to the pump. Now, my sisters and I at the time we all had kids under the age of 5. So I was in a bit of shock, but this is not the first time that something like this has happened to me before. I've actually been denied lodging, across America. When I've asked for, a room at a hotel, I've been told, nope, we don't have any rooms available. Well, there are only 2 cars in the lot. How could you possibly not have any hotel rooms available for my family? Same thing here. So I drove up to the office, because I didn't want to yell at the park ranger in front of my kids. My sisters and I went, and the explanation given was that we were illegally parking and we were illegally showering. And if somehow we could resolve the parking issue, then we would be okay. So, we looked at the map and we said, well, there's showers over here with parking, spots. So let's go talk to him. So we did, and it was still not acceptable. So what he told us was that we had to pay yet another fee for a regular site with water and electricity so that we could actually use the public showers. Now, here's a person who is supposed to be serving everyone, and he's treating us differently. Now, I don't usually get mad, but I did then, and I told him that he was being racist. You ever seen an Asian woman, a tiny Asian woman, be really loud? Yeah, I know. I'm not very often, but I was then. Because here was the act of racism. This man who was being in a public role, the minute he had unconscious bias as a person who was treating me differently based on race and used institutional power to say, you are not a registered camper, he was using his sovereign authority in government, which is, government is the only entity that has the ability to regulate everybody, right? So he's in an institutional role, and he's used it to deny me a public service that any white person, any family, walking into that campsite, if they'd paid the whatever fee to get into the park, could have gone in to shower. So I threatened him, that kind of worked. But the differential response here was the policy wasn't wrong. It was the application of that policy that was wrong, based on race. And that is so much of what we're seeing right now with everything that's going on. Because our policies may not be wrong, they may not be perpetuating racial disparities, but we are perpetuating them as public administrators who actually interpret what that means. The inconsistent application of laws and regulations does create a disproportionate impact. And this is happening in our classrooms with our teachers, with all of the systems that we create, this interpretation. So I thought I would talk to you about three things this morning: white identity and public administration. This was the basis of my dissertation, because I was tired of being studied as a person of color. So I said, I want to know what white anti-racist allies are doing. It's not like people of color have made progress alone. What are all the really people who are racially conscious who are white doing? What's happening? So I'm going to share some of that with you, because by and large, public administrators, especially in public education, are still white. And I want you to know that it is okay. It's like when I show up and I give diversity presentations and I say, I'm here, I'm Hmong, I'm female, and it's gonna be okay, It's gonna be okay. I'm not gonna dislike you. Actions and lessons from Wilder, things that we've learned in changing our own institutions, and then just a few closing comments. So what about white identity and public administration? So I have a doctorate in public administration, and I care a lot about inclusion, which is, every person in this community has a part of the solution. And white people do too. So my question was, what personal and organizational factors contribute to white public administrators actively representing racial minority interests? Okay, so that's really a handful. But basically it's, why do people who work in government, what is it about them personally and their organizations that actually contribute to a more equitable society or more equitable work in the community? Now, why is this an important question? This is a really important question because, we have an ethic that basically, an ethic of race is, to achieve really social equity due to centuries of oppression, slavery, colonialism, war, and white racial framing, it's really important for us to unpack whiteness in America. What does it mean? One of the most inspiring things I learned in reading about being white in America and not being told that, yeah, you are a race and actually having an identity, is that there were whole campaigns that purged the histories of white people who helped free the slaves and helped build cross-race coalitions in the South so that black people could vote. And there were very divisive strategies that other white people took policy-wise. So the governor of Oklahoma kept racism out of Oklahoma. Ever wonder why people talk about Oklahoma being a place where a lot of blacks went? Well, that was why. But we don't tell these stories. The other thing is racial disparities persist because despite cross-sector and public efforts that are underway, Minnesota has the worst racial disparities, not just in education, but in healthcare, in like income disparities. You name it, it's there. Our ethic of public service as public administrators in education or elsewhere compels us to change. Government exists so that all people can prosper. We are probably one of the, we have to safeguard the public good. This study is unique. I actually found out that no one had actually studied white people in public administration before. Turns out we've studied women, Latinos, blacks, Asians, not whites. And then, how have white allies been able to make change? Because people of color haven't done it alone. So a few normalizing kind of like definition things. Race is socially constructed. You can disagree with it. This is just what I'm saying. Because we know, no biological basis other than skin color. Go back to my example. That park ranger had no idea who I was. I was a mother with 4 small children. And instantaneously, there was judgment, and you can't do this, and all these other things. No idea. Race forms in relation to others. It's reinforced through in-group and out-group processes, boundary maintenance, and identity delineation. That's a fancy way of saying racism is polarizing. Look at what's happening with Black Lives Matter. If you are black right now in this community, you are having to explain Black Lives Matter and what you think about it. If you are white, you are having to explain what Black Lives Matter and how you feel about it. Racism has an impact, and race in general, because it polarizes us, because that's how we define our categories, and that's how we've been socialized. White identity can be weak or strong, heterogeneous, and is defined in relation to other social identities. What does that mean? It means that I don't know that I'm white until you tell me I'm white. It means that as MayKao Hang, I don't walk around saying, I am a Hmong woman and I look Asian. I didn't even feel that at the camp. I was just me. And then all of a sudden, some guy comes up and says, you can't do this. And I'm propelled into seeing again my race. Well, I don't go around thinking that, and I don't think people do in general. Also, you can be a supremacist, a white supremacist, or you can be a white anti-racist ally. That's basically what this says. White identity is not the same for every person. And society assigns value to people based on skin color, and then here's the really important thing, which starts happening all over the place, getting reproduced, is that we assign resources based on race. Your performance is better or worse because of your race. You are more or less competent because of your race. I mean, we're doing this subconsciously, okay? Just to make it personal, the way it comes out to me is people are always telling me that I'm really articulate. And I'm like, you know what? I'm the CEO of the Wilder Foundation. Why would you expect me to not be articulate? It's a compliment I get over and over again. But I've actually never met a CEO who's not articulate. Because if you aren't, you shouldn't be CEO probably. Do you know what I mean? But people don't think about it. Okay, so white identity and characteristics. Being white, I mean, this is from the literature. I'm not making any of this up. This is like from studies that have gone on for a long time, from other fields, sociology, anthropology, other places, not public administration. Being white is being the norm. It means that, you know how like in Microsoft Word, you have Times New Roman 12 is your default mode? Yeah, being white is the default mode. You don't have to do anything to be it. That's how you are. Social dynamics and structural advantages, this is the, whether you think you have privilege or not, you just do. You didn't do anything to create it. It's just there. It's like, for me, being physically able, I was born this way. I mean, do I blame my body for being physically able? Don't blame yourself for being white. I mean, this whole guilt thing sometimes is really interesting to me, right? Being white white identity is also unmarked and invisible. So these usually come out as, I'm colorblind. Of course there's no bias. I believe everybody is like me. And I don't have a culture. I don't know what you're talking about. The other thing is that whiteness becomes more prominent when there's resistance. You're being challenged. So the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement is challenging so many of us to think about race as a factor in police brutality is really about, just whichever race you're coming from. It's becoming more prominent. You feel really white, or you feel really Asian, or really black. The myth of meritocracy, this would be, as it applies to me, wow, MayKao, you're an amazing person. You must have such an internal store of resilience and all these other things. And it's like, you know what? That's somewhat true, but I had a great public education. I had wonderful teachers. I had public investments. I had a church that, gave me donuts in the morning and that I really enjoyed, so I kept going to church. The myth of meritocracy is somehow as individuals, we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. Well, you know what? People don't have boots to put on, a lot of times in our public schools. How can they do this? But this myth of meritocracy actually reinforces white superiority. Now, what does that mean? It means that even though there's so many policies and so much history that has actually advantaged certain groups, particularly white people in America, that we continue to actually believe that for some reason, kids of color or families are not, they're doing it to themselves. Sort of a little bit of a victim thing. So these are a few things that studies say about white identity. Could be positive or negative. White people are the most spatially and socially segregated racial group in America. And I just read the Metropolitan Council's Fair Housing study. If you haven't done it, we are the most racially segregated. There are all these little indicators, and we are so racially segregated as a metropolitan area. I also found that, people can't measure racial consciousness very well. And there aren't great tools for us to do that, which makes it harder for us to actually make progress about how do we change our mindsets. The general assumption during anti-racism training is that exposures of white people to people of color like me somehow is going to increase racial consciousness and also create a more non-racist world. I don't know if that's true or not. I do know that when you have many diverse perspectives on your management teams, you're less likely to make mistakes. So I don't know if that's true or not, because you can spend your whole life living next to someone who's black or whatever, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're any more racially conscious. You have to be intentional about it. So we can do this together, but not if we isolate ourselves from each other, is one of the things that I learned. Some of the people who I interviewed, this was a qualitative study because we don't have great counts or quantitative data about racial consciousness and white privilege and white identity. But I did find that the public administrators who are making the most progress, that is changing how they were operating, changing how their services were being delivered. They were not isolating themselves from people who are very different from them. In fact, they were seeking it out and disrupting their social circles, not at work, but at home and in volunteering. There was a woman who was a social worker who'd worked for a county for like 30 years, and she was like organizing the Rotary Club. She's like at the university doing stuff, talking to different groups, using the community as leverage to change the systems that were creating disadvantages for the Somali and Latino populations in the midst. The other thing I learned is that organizational factors do really matter. So like if you have an organization that says diversity is important to me, we have a racial equity plan, that though it's disruptive for some people, if you define it right and you keep educating people to it, it does change behavior. Legal compliance methods do change. The willingness to use your authority matters. A lot of the public administrators that I talked to who are making massive progress basically were saying, well, I don't really care if I'm a line staff person over here. The equivalent in a public school system would be, you're just a teacher, volunteering for different groups inside of the organization to make change processes happen. The really interesting thing that happened was that as long as that person, and remember, these are all white people, this white person had support from another white person who happened to be their supervisor, they were still making massive progress, which really kind of debunked the idea that you need to be in some high-level administration position to do it. In fact, I interviewed people who were in the highest ranks in county government, and they were still doing it, but they were doing it with their elected officials and others. I mean, they were just unapologetic about their willingness to use their authority to make positive change, but they weren't always explicit about it. In other words, they had the intent and action. They sometimes didn't articulate it necessarily very well, but they knew exactly what they were doing, and they weren't apologizing for it. And they usually did it in a way that was creating more inclusion. In other words, not polarizing people. And then this last bullet is, you don't need to be someone from a particular race to actually be championing racial equity. I think sometimes, we do this to ourselves, which is, hey, if you're Asian, then you must care about diversity. And you know what? Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. It's called role adoption. So as long as you have the business case clear in your heads about why this needs to happen and why you can gain the knowledge and skills. You can be a good ally. And the other thing I learned that was kind of scary is if you have positive intent and you think you know what you're doing, but you're not using other diverse perspectives to supplement your own, I found in at least a quarter of the people, a third of the group that I talked to, that they were very conflicted and that they actually were perpetuating racial disparities. In other words, positive intent without racial consciousness was perpetuating racial disparities. So, any questions about that part? I'm going to have a little bit of a Q&A at the end. So I wanted to switch now. So that was part one. And part two is, well, what have we learned at Wilder? I mean, what are we doing? I know you can't see this dashboard. It's very tiny. So I just like to start out with metrics at Wilder Foundation. We have about 400 staff and 2,000 volunteers. And we don't even count things like St. Paul Promise neighborhoods as our own, right? Because it's a community collaborative. But what we do is we have a diversity dashboard. We've set some broad metrics. And we measure supervisors and managers by gender, by race and ethnicity, turnover by race and ethnicity, our breakdowns of people of color to white people among staff, So these are just general metrics, and we do disability and veteran status. We use this tool called the Intercultural Development Inventory. How many of you are familiar with it? Okay. The reason why we use it is to actually get us to common language. There's nothing good or bad necessarily about being at any stage or the other. But what's important is that people understand that they have a culture and they're looking at the world through a particular lens. So for those of you who wear glasses, how many of you realize that you are wearing glasses every day? How many of you are conscious about it all the time? Right. That's about having a worldview and not really understanding how culture is impacting how you're absorbing information. That's what the IDI tool does. So we started in 2013 collecting data from all of our staff. This is all voluntary, by the way. And what we want to see is more people up here that are blue and fewer down here, which is happening, right? And there were fewer people who took it because it's all voluntary at Wilder. We wanted to see if people were actually taking the tool, adopting it, and then changing themselves, changing their behaviors. So until you reach a stage called acceptance, so minimization is, I have my glasses on, but I don't even know I have glasses. This is the stage where you say, well, I don't have a culture. I don't understand. The first developmental task professionally is to say, oh, I do have a culture. This is the shape and size of my glasses. I grew up in rural Minnesota. I'm used to farming. If I had told you, so if I had said 10 years ago, I'm a Hmong woman who grew up really poor in St. Paul and all these other things, and it's been so hard to actually get through to college, I would have burst into tears. I could not have told you that story because I wasn't culturally competent enough with my worldview. Because in my mind, I couldn't understand why people couldn't see race, and I couldn't understand why people couldn't see culture. So we've used the Intercultural Development Inventory as a whole change tool, and we're just measuring our progress. And then we track applicants that are coming in. Now, why is this important? It's important because in about 7 years, we've gone from the mid-30s in terms of percentages of people of color to 41%. But I have not held a stick at all to any of my staff to say, you must hire a person of color here and here and here and here. It turns out that understanding your worldview and becoming more culturally competent, which is more skill-based, not necessarily racial consciousness, actually still raises racial consciousness. And people are just changing their behaviors because they want to. So how many of you have mandatory diversity training? It's okay if you do. How many of you encourage diversity training, but you don't encourage diversity training? How many of you allocate resources so that teachers and others can actually get some diversity training? Okay. Yep. Where you budget and allocate your resources in terms of time, people, and just in general, is an indication of how people feel valued in what you're doing, and you don't have to tell them, you don't have to say you are mandated to do this. So one of the things we learned was we have to have a common framework for engagement at all levels. If people don't feel included in being a part of the solution, you're probably not going to be successful. So this is our framework for engagement at all levels. And usually when you do this, and for whatever institutions that you're part of, having key identified roles attached to that framework really matters. So let's just look at employees. What can employees do to improve diversity and inclusion? They can attend employee resource group meetings. They can engage to improve their own cultural competency. They can provide insight and feedback to improve impact for management, but also in the classroom, say, for example, for you guys. And then we have two tracks of training and recognition for people who are doing a good job that we've created. The Kingston Fellowship, which is for advanced study to $5,000 for any staff person who wants to advance themselves in understanding their field and contributing. And the Clinical Training Institute, which is for people of color who are having trouble passing their licensing exams to be mental health professionals because we had a shortage. So you can see that mission is at the center, And our mission, as it connects to diversity, is to serve and be here for all, regardless of background. That's what I said at the beginning. And our board of directors, by the way, are stewards of the mission. That's true in public service, too, so that you're recasting the whole organization as being a part of something larger. We also use the same language. How many of you use the same language for the work that you're doing around the achievement gap in your schools? Yeah. We at Wilder, this has been a continuous journey, but we fought a lot about how to define what we were working on. And literally, we were stuck in this phase for more than a decade. Until we adopted the IDI framework as a common basis of information for every person, even if you didn't want to take it, we couldn't make progress. So use the same language and make sure that you're training to it. The other thing we learned is that we have to accept that we're part of the problem. Because if we can do that, we can actually also accept that we're the ones that need to change and that we can actually take part in the solution. Because until you say, I own this, it is a part of us and our institution, and maybe as an individual leader, I'm not as culturally competent or racially conscious as I need to be, until you do that, and then you start working on connecting your individual actions with institutional impact, kind of like the park ranger didn't do that, at Whitewater, then you can start making progress. And setting big goals, like stretch goals. I actually made up the goals for the dashboard. I didn't have anything to go on. I just thought, well, what the heck? I just want us to have progress, so I just set them. And then they were kind of kept in a very closed spot for a while until I felt like, I think that might be right. So the failure there was, I thought we could get to 90% with the intercultural development inventory. It turns out that our turnover rate is about 18%. Yeah, we weren't going to be getting to 90%, right? We've also learned that mandatory is not good in doing this work, that we need the hearts of people to change. You can get the head to change, but if the heart doesn't change, it's a temporary change. I'm changing it because it's a compliance requirement. I'm changing because, so we're after people's hearts and true transformation. So we make our efforts voluntary and organic, and we set up incentives to actually have that happen. So when we said, hey, you know what, if you do intercultural competency training, we're gonna set aside a pool of funds that you can just tap into. And by the way, if you want to be promoted, we like you to be more culturally competent, things like that. And we have, in our work environment, we've created a lot of support groups for people so that they have a place to go to talk about stuff. So in our organization, the work around diversity and inclusion is actually led by a group called the Inclusion Action Team. Our VPs, vice presidents, the senior team takes the lead from the Inclusion Action Team, which is a cross-foundation, all levels of management group. You have to apply to get in, but their task is to catalyze an organizational culture that is fully inclusive, committed to diversity, and positions Wilder effectively to achieve its mission. Almost 60% of the clients that we serve are people of color, and we need to do better. And because the organization, 70-some% of what we spend is on salaries. Our staff are the tools, are the people who are going to be doing that delivery. Also very true for public education. The other thing we've learned is that if we don't make a commitment to having pressure on the inside and outside, we actually go into what I call complacency mode. So we create pressure from inside and outside the organization for change, because the organization is larger than just the staff. It's the board, it's the community, it's all these things. So I actually come out and I talk to groups like this to create more pressure for me to change and the organization itself to change. Because without that public commitment, overall in terms of our reputation and the work that we're doing, when I leave this place and I'm no longer the CEO, the expectation is gone. It can't be a single individual type of thing. So we report our results to the community. Our board of directors also take part in the IDI. We put things on our website, and you guys are all welcome to go to our website. A lot of this stuff is on there. Wilder.org. Go to About Us and go to the diversity page, okay? We also are doing this a lot, which is embracing and stepping into conflict. When cultural or racial conflict happens, we actually let staff fix them with guidance and support. Oftentimes this shows up as performance issues, which may be real or not, because it becomes racialized. We just had an email go out from one of our white administrators at Wilder Foundation, who's the CFO. She was sending out an email about a Black Lives Matter protest near the Wilder Center. And the way the email was phrased, which went out to 200 people, really generated, because it came from an assumption of us being afraid of black people, reinforcing negative stereotypes. She sent out an apology email 2 days later saying, I'm sorry I did this. We let her fix it. I stood by her, and we had a lot of listening sessions to talk about what were the stereotypes embedded in that email. Now, some organizations, they just run away from that. No apology, whatever. We had listening groups, we had support, we created some more safe spaces, we did an apology. And then I did a follow-up with, these are the 3 actions we're gonna do institutionally, these are the 3 actions that we're gonna do to promote a more inclusive workplace, so this doesn't happen again. Reserving judgment, that's been a great skill that we've all learned. And then we try out different solutions based on different assumptions. So the typical assumption, because I just used the Black Lives Matter email that got sent out at Wilder Center as a case study at the Senior Leadership Institute for the state of Minnesota. And the group was 40 people who are white, 2 people who are black. All the white people, and I had taken away all the names and everything in the case study. The white people, all the tables that reported said, this is a bad person, you shouldn't have hired this person. What are your hiring criteria for this, for your organization? And showed less forgiveness for the person who actually sent out the email. The assumption was, you should have been more racially conscious as someone who is white working at Wilder. The 2 black people who happened to be sitting at the same table, the one black gentleman raised his hand and said, I think this is an amazing organization. I would never get an apology from management like this. Such different perspectives. So don't be afraid of embracing conflict and being courageous. The other thing that we do is we identify and eliminate policies and practice that prevent diversity and inclusion. So because our HR director has become more racially and culturally conscious through her own development process as a leader, because she is an HR expert, she did a racial and gender equity analysis on our compensation system. We have completely adopted a new philosophy. It was amazing. I wanted to stand up and applaud, because you know what? I couldn't have done that as the CEO. I don't know enough about HR policies. So here's what she said. So she did this breakdown, and she said, our seniority-based system at Wilder Foundation has created disadvantages for young people, women. There was a $10,000 compensation difference for people of color. She did lags in promotion, all this stuff. And then she gave us a new compensation philosophy to consider, which we ran by our HR committee of the board, and we adopted. It was amazing. So do stuff like that. Yeah, we also had the LGBT support group, the staff, said, you know what, we have a lot of LGBT youth who are coming, and we have barriers in our public forums. We need to eliminate some of those barriers. First of all, they felt comfortable coming to us to tell us that. And secondly, we resourced it. And the third thing was, it took them 2 years to do it, but we did it, okay? So things like that. This is the last one. We assume that people of color and the clients we serve are actually right about their life experiences. When they say, such and such a person, this was said to me, we just say, wow, that was bad. Or we just validate them. We don't say 20 questions. Well, why would you feel that way? Da, da, da. Did it really happen? And a lot of times when people of color or low-income families come to us, that's what we do. So we incorporate clients also into the design process. This is called the informing stage, the agenda setting stage, and the design stage. And then we adopt culturally competent research principles, and we look at our resources. If we say diversity is important, what fraction of our budget is actually being used to resource that? If we say the achievement gap is important, and these are the 2 things we're going to tackle, are we putting money behind it, right? And then to the extent possible, people of color control their stories, not us. They tell us what story they want to tell, not us telling them what story they have. That's a really important distinction because we do that a lot, and we have to catch ourselves too. So here's the thing in terms of closing comments. There can be unity within diversity. You know, that piece that I talked about at the beginning about how race and culture sometimes polarizes us, that's a bill of goods someone else sold us a long time ago and that we continue to do ourselves because of many socializing forces. And I'm here to tell you, I've seen it work. There can be unity within diversity. In fact, if you think about our history as a country of displaced people, that's all it's ever been. You know, that's all it's ever been. I don't know why we believe that we have to be so far apart. But it starts out with us believing that there can be unity within diversity. No one person has the answers because we're all very different people. And if you remember that, you know, while we may share some experiences, we're also very different from each other, then we can listen better to each other and we can believe each other more. Like when I tell this story about Whitewater State Park, people who know me personally are so upset. But it's the story of my life. It happens all the time. It happens all the time. Authentic engagement, you know, I think this is really about, you know, we have to be more okay with telling stories of failure. Because sometimes when we sit in leadership positions, people think that we should know what we're doing, and we think that too. And the truth is, we don't know what the hell we're doing. If we did, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in, okay? The whole world can't be right, you know, or I mean, we have systems designs that mirror perfectly what intents may have been 20 years ago. The future is going to look very different. And every day you have that possibility of change. Apologize when you make mistakes, recover, and try again. I mess up all the time. And you know, people expect me to mess up with management issues and all that. Well, I mess up with racial issues too. And you know, it should be, it's like I've seen really competent leaders who are great problem solvers when they talk about the issue of race, they just totally shut down. We lack the vocabulary to actually have a decent conversation about it. And it's because I think we are afraid of making mistakes. And you know, there's no reason to be. Find a safe place to do that. And then know when the forces are bigger than you are. In other words, the mantle of responsibility in public leadership is very large. But know that you are not alone. Because it belongs to all of us. And the more people that you can enlist, the more also that you can connect your actions to institutional outcomes, the better off you're going to be. Because you don't have to do it all at one time. You can just pick different pieces to work on it at any given time. It took me about 2 years to get out of this stage called minimization into acceptance, because I couldn't believe that people couldn't see diversity, you know, and see race. I don't know, just took me 2 years to figure out. So why don't I stop there? And I think we've got maybe like 10 minutes or so for questions. So I'm happy to help answer any questions that you may have. Or just comments, if you want to share a comment.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm having a little trouble sort of balancing a couple things you said. Mm-hmm. You said that we should not assume that just because we're white, we think white, and you know, we can't represent the whole white race.
That's right.
So other races, same story. Mm-hmm. So let me put this into a real life question. So I have a new neighbor, and she's black, and you said be intentional about making relationships with people of other races. So if I go and try and make a relationship with her just because she's black, isn't that assuming that she represents blackness? So how do we avoid, you know, sort of perpetuating all those stereotypes?
Yeah, well, you know, the question would be, well, are you trying to get to know her because she's black or because she's your neighbor?
Well, it would be because she's my neighbor,
yeah.
but be intentional about mm-hmm. including, you know, when you said leadership should have mm-hmm. diversity.
Yeah.
Intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're hiring intentionally mm-hmm. to get diversity, isn't that, I can't, maybe I'm missing the point, but if, you don't want to just make quotas so
Right.
that those people represent, among attitude.
Right. Yeah, so I think I know what you're asking, or maybe I'll just give you a response in terms of my own experiences with hiring, and maybe that might help. So our version of diversity at Wilder Foundation is manyfold. Race is one of them. Socioeconomic status could be someone who's from the GLBT community. That is not necessarily what we're seeking when we're hiring. What we're seeking are people who can understand the experiences of our clients, welcome diversity, and be highly competent in the roles that they have. What we do ensure is that there is a very diverse pool of candidates from many different perspectives, and then they go through the selection process. And then what we try to do is to not introduce bias into the hiring system in terms of saying it has to be this kind of person or that kind of person, black, white, whatever. And then and then we hire them. Turns out that by having a very diverse pool, being clear about having candidates who care about the kind of work that we do, that we get really candidates who are from very diverse backgrounds. So it's not tokenism is having input without real impact. That's not what we're talking about here. Talking about, when you're intentional, it's a diverse pool. No person of color wants to believe, and I don't want to believe this, that the only reason why I'm president of the Wilder Foundation is because I'm a Hmong woman or an Asian person. I had 15 years of human services experience every sector that Wilder deals with when I applied for the role. That's why I was hired. I mean, that's what I want to believe. So I think that's true of a lot of people. But, I think that the nuance between I just want to be with you because you're of this type of background or whatever, there's nothing wrong with being curious about people who are very different from you. And even people who are really similar to you, because you learn all these different things. But if that's the only threshold for entry, then I would say, yeah, that would be wrong. Ask yourself what your assumptions are before you engage with people. If this is a person who's my neighbor and I want to get to know them, then great. Does that help? I think that there is a common belief that somehow if you try to recruit from a diverse pool, that somehow you're diminishing the quality of the candidates, and that has not been true in my experience. And also that's one of the myths that keeps racism alive is that somehow people of color are inferior to white people in some way, shape, or form. Because it's just a narrative that's playing in our heads. It's what we see in the media. It's what people have told us over time through science. I mean, all these things that we don't necessarily truly aren't on the forefront of our brains, but that we believe. It's sort of like the comment about me being articulate, or like when Asians can speak English really well. We're Americans too. My daughter, who's 15, came home one day and she was really mad because she goes to East Ridge High School, and she was frustrated because she went from a middle school that went into we live in a little neighborhood that got fed into a much bigger high school. So the kids there didn't know her freshman year, and she came home and she said, "Mom, I'm really mad because people keep asking me what kind of Asian I am." And I tell them, "I'm American." And they say, "Well, where were you born?" She goes, "I was born at Regents Hospital." Yeah. And then they go, "No, where are you really from?" And she's like, "I'm from Woodbury." It's not ever satisfactory. But and I said, "What did you say?" She goes, "Well, if you're talking about my parents, I'm Hmong." And they're like, "Oh, okay." And then I said, "Well, then what do you ask them?" She goes, "I ask them what kind of white they are." And they say, they don't know. I mean, how dumb is that, Mom? Right? I mean, kids can give us such insight into the world of how we racialize things. Yep. Any other questions?
I think it kind of fits with the first question. And I wonder if you would help me to understand diversity when we talk with our children in school, and we often refer to children of color and children of poverty. why does it have to be color in there?
Mm-hmm.
Because there are many, many people that are of different color than I am, that are much brighter and much richer and much more experienced than I am. So why are they included in this? If you just comment.
Yeah, this is maybe more from a mom perspective than anything else. Is when we say to kids that we don't see their skin color, they wonder what's wrong with them because they see it. That's how I experience it with my own children, anyway. And then, even though we want to believe that we live in a world where all children, regardless of skin color, race, are treated the same, or that people love them as much as we do, the truth is that it's a rare individual who doesn't do that, because we've been socialized to actually see it, and so to see that we're being treated differently. So this is about patterns of behavior, maybe not from you, but from many others. So my son came home when he was 10 one day. He was in the lunch line, and there was a black kid, 2 kids ahead of him, who was not given his lunch because he didn't have his PIN number, and he didn't have it written on his hand. Like sometimes I make my kids do that when it's the first couple weeks of school and they're little. The only explanation my son Fuchi could come up with was because that kid was black. Because he had been in that lunch line dozens of times seeing white kids be given their lunch. And he cried when he talked to me about it. So because Fuchi could see that this kid was black, and he's an Asian kid, right? In Woodbury, not very diverse yet, but soon to be, especially with smaller kids. I had to validate his experience as being different and legitimate, because that's what his interpretation was. And then we had to have a conversation about, even though how the lunch lady is white, she may still not be a bad person. Now this happens again and again to my kids who are Asian in the Woodbury schools, right? Because my daughter has been denied assistance with sports. My son was put in detention when there was a situation during middle school when the other 2 kids who happened to be white weren't put in detention for the same situation. He wasn't one of the instigators. And so there have been really hard lessons to learn about that. And the only explanation for that type of differential treatment was the fact that he looked different. That was his explanation. But if it's a pattern of behavior and treatment from others, you can deny it over time. It really impacts you psychologically. That's what we're talking about. Because, the bedrock and foundation of learning is feeling good about yourself. That's why we need to not deny that we see that you are different, but you are also beautiful. That's been the message. But to deny that difference exists and to say I don't see it denies the incorporation of a story that child has made to interpret their world. And unfortunately, this is the part about racialized experiences that do matter, is most people think I'm a very logical person and that I'm, know what I'm talking about. But when I'm talking about racism, people just can't believe what I tell them. And it's like, I tell you stuff about other stuff and you believe me. Why wouldn't you believe this, And it's because of this thing I'm talking about. We are socialized to believe and to understand the world through our own culture and lens and how we get treated. So we can't possibly believe that someone like me could actually still live that experience. And, we do. That's just the reality. But kids live that too. But they don't have the words to describe what they're experiencing. So we need to actually say, yeah, it is a different experience. I come from a family that's married into other races. And so when my son, now who's 17, talks about this stuff, and he gets very judgmental about white people, because, it gets easy to do that sometimes when you're a person of color after all these patterns of behavior. I remind him that we have family that are white, and that, it's not something that we do to ourselves. It's larger forces at play that we need to resist. Yep, to embed love and not hate, and not negativity into all the people who look this way for the rest of the world. And that's the message we need to give to each other and to kids. That they are legitimate and they're valuable and that they are different, but that different is beautiful and it's okay.
Thank you. I'm Jim Carlson. I'm a senator from Eagan and Burnsville, and
Yep.
We're undergoing some diversity increase, let's say, but I'm trying to ask a question that I can't really frame very high quality, but let's say on a scale of 1 to 10,
Yep.
where 1 things are in a crisis, emergency. We need to change. We need to change now. To 10, everything's fine. Everything's okay. We don't need to change. When you've been standing there and
Yep.
talking to us, what do you think about the diversity in this room? Where are we on that scale? What should we be doing? Now, I can tell you one thing, that the legislators that are all here, I think, are all white, because we don't have very many people of color in the legislature. And I think that that's something that we need to change.
Yeah.
I would put that as somewhere under 5 anyway.
Yeah.
Where do you think we should be with our school administration and the way we administer, let's say, teaching policy, gap policy, all of those kinds of things? Where should we be located on that scale?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a complex question for a scale answer. What I would say is, we have to start recognizing that regardless of what race we come from, we have a responsibility to actually get schooled up on understanding how racism impacts our kids and our society. And if you are a white person who has considerable privilege, like a legislator or a school administrator or whatever, don't apologize for your privilege. Use it as a weapon for good. I mean, adopt and champion racial minorities. There's nothing more powerful than a white guy, a white heterosexual guy. Don't know if there are any of these in here. I mean, looking around, just guessing, who stands up and says, you know what? We are experiencing too much racism in our schools. As a white guy who is a legislator, I recognize that maybe the way I'm seeing the world is not the way it should be, and I'm willing to listen and redirect funds in a way that will truly improve the classroom experience for teachers and whatever it might be. I mean, I think that would do so much. Because it's different than when I say it. People expect a person of color to, so we need to change some of the messengers, and public administrators and legislators, that's probably the most influential you could possibly be to stand up and to actually say that and to really mean it. And then, take the IDI, get schooled up, understand how you see the world and how it might be so different than how other people are seeing the world. Because when I walk into our public schools anywhere now, the world doesn't look like this group. But yet this group is the group that needs to bridge to the next generation so that we can continue to be a vital state. Does that help? Are we in crisis? 10. Yeah. I think it's starting to feel a lot to me like the next civil rights movement, quite honestly. I mean, with the things that are going on in the world, when are we going to wake up and make it more important in our lives? Yeah. Okay.